For the chapter on muscle tissue, we're going to be eventually considering skeletal muscle primarily as the muscular system, but we're going to start to look at the different types of muscle tissue in this first unit. First, we're going to look at characteristics of muscle tissue in general, and then the function of those organs that contain those muscle tissues. Muscle tissue is excitable, which means that a signal will arrive and tell it what to do. Traditionally, that's from the nervous system, but there are situations where other signals, usually endocrine signals, can cause muscle tissue to be active. Now, contractility is usually what we think of as being the most important part of muscle tissue. It generates force by getting shorter, and we talk about muscle contraction quite a bit. Extensibility is sort of the opposite of that, which is you can stretch muscle tissue out. It can get longer. That can actually improve its ability to contract in certain situations. Now, contractility and extensibility are sort of two sides of the same coin. They result in the ability for muscles to be used over and over again. That continual reuse is possible because of the property of elasticity, that the muscle tissue can be stretched out and contract and stretch out and contract and always still behave in the way that it was originally meant to. If we consider what muscles do, this is a list of their basic functions. Now, when we say muscle, sometimes it sounds like we're referring to just the tissue and sometimes to the organ. You have to pay attention to the context where that applies. And for functions like this, we're talking about organ-level functions. Muscles produce movement, and that comes straight out of the fact that they're contractile. There are important muscles that help maintain posture. Mostly those are skeletal muscles. Then the energetic demands of muscle tissue is going to generate heat as mitochondria make ATP and muscles use ATP. Those are both exothermic reactions and will generate heat. And then we can say generally that muscle is important for storage of movement of substances in the various organ systems. It would seem that this would apply more to the smooth and cardiac muscle tissue, as smooth muscle moves food through the digestive tract or air through regions of the respiratory tract, or cardiac muscle moves blood through the cardiovascular system. Sphincters will store substances in certain locations like the bladder, but we can also consider skeletal muscle being part of that, whether it's directly related to breathing, like the diaphragm, or skeletal muscle is important for aspects of blood movement, not directly, but as an indirect assist to moving blood, say, out of our legs. This brings us to considering the three different types of muscle tissue. Now, we're going to consider them here in terms of how they appear through the microscope and how we can differentiate between them. That's based on really two major characteristics of the tissue as we view it under the microscope. First is striations, which is describing a stripe pattern that may or may not be visible. And the other is nucleation, meaning how many nuclei there are in a cell. You would expect that a cell should have only one nucleus, but there is a situation where cells can have multiple nuclei. So let's look at the three different types of tissue up close and see how these characteristics play out. Skeletal muscle is characterized, as we view it under the microscope, as being striated and multinucleated, which means that there's an alternating pattern of light and dark bands, stripes, across this muscle fibers. And the muscle fibers, which are individual cells, have multiple nuclei. The skeletal muscle fibers run the whole length of this muscle, or at least a particular region of the muscle. So they can be up to 30 centimeters long, which is very large for a cell. And what really happened during development is the individual cells merged together to make a complete cell, sort of a supercell. And so all of the nuclei of those original cells are present in the mature muscle fiber cells that we look at these days. Looking at skeletal muscle tissue under the microscope, we can see a clear banding pattern across these fibers. Also, there are probably about 10 fibers passing through this field of view, but there are dozens of nuclei present. The nuclei are usually visible along the edge of the muscle fibers because the bulk of the muscle fiber is made up of the proteinaceous contractile organelles. Those individual nuclei are responsible for controlling muscle. Those individual nuclei are responsible for controlling protein synthesis and maintenance in that local area. Cardiac muscle is also striated, which points to the fact that cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle work on very similar principles, the way that they contract. Cardiac muscle, however, is mononucleated, which is important because cardiac muscle in the heart has to take on a three-dimensional shape, whereas skeletal muscle is usually very linear. It pulls one end of the muscle towards the other end of the muscle in a fairly straight line. But cardiac muscle, the cells need to be individual because they have to take on a three-dimensional shape for the whole organ. Also, cardiac muscle contains what are called intercalated discs, which are actually protein-rich areas showing the boundary between two cells, because while they're mononucleated individual cells, there are actually ion channels that connect one cell to the next, so electrically they behave as a single population of cells. This micrograph of cardiac muscle tissue is not the best example of these characteristics that we can see. It's a little bit out of focus. But if you look at the muscle fiber that's going across the top right corner about 3 or 4 down, there's a gap just next to it, but it looks like it's adjacent to 2 or 3 other fibers right there. If you look at that closely, you might be able to get a sense of the striations in that tissue. Now, I also point that tissue out because that particular fiber out, because right next to the edge of the field of view, there's a dark line adjacent to some more dark staining area, but a very sharp dark line, right? That's an intercalated disc. That's pretty much right at the center point on the right side of the field of view if you're trying to locate it. As far as multinucleated, you can look across here and see that there are not more nuclei than there are fibers visible. And also, again, that's not the best image, but these fibers going across aren't all complete cells. There might be 2 cells within one fiber that we see going across here. And using the word fiber that way is a little bit misleading. We usually use fiber to refer to a muscle cell. And so 2 muscle cells might actually be abutted up next to each other, looking like a continuous fiber through this field of view. But in fact, it's multiple fibers. Smooth muscle really stands out from the other 2 types of muscle in that it's not striated. It's going to be a fairly lightly staining tissue. It is also mononucleated, meaning that the cells are individual, but it's not quite the same as cardiac muscle tissue in that the cells are completely independent from each other. They don't have any ion channels connecting them to each other. Because smooth muscle is not striated, it stains very lightly or monochromatically, and it's hard to really make out the boundaries of the individual muscle fibers, but they're about the width of one of these nuclei. And so imagining how thick they are, across this field of view, there's probably a couple of dozen or more fibers present, and if you count up the nuclei, there's definitely fewer than a 1-to-1 ratio there, because we might not be seeing the nuclei of every single cell in this field of view, but definitely they're mononucleated. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Contractility and extensibility are 2 sides of the same coin. And so as we can stretch muscles out and they contract back in and they get used over and over again, the property of elasticity is the one that is a combination of those 2 and allows for muscles to maintain their properties over their entire lifetime of use.